Thank you. I would ask those members who are leaving the chamber to please do so quickly and quietly, as we will now move on to the next item of business. And the next item of business is a debate on motion 20388 in the name of Jim Fairley on the Crofting and Scottish Land Court Bill at stage 1. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Minister Jim Fairley to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move this motion in my name. I'm pleased to open today's debate on the Crofting and Scottish Land Court Bill. And I want to thank the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee for their detailed scrutiny of the bill, and all of those who gave evidence at stage 1. Most importantly, I'd like to thank the Crofting communities for their invaluable insights and contributions, including those who I spoke to during my visits to Lewis, Harris and Skye. And I look forward to working constructively across the chamber as we progress this important piece of legislation, and I hope that today we can all agree to support its general principles as the committee recommended in their stage 1 report. The bill has two main parts, and I would like to begin by focusing on part 1, the crofting element of it. Crofting is a part of who we are. It was and is a hard-earned living tradition that shapes our rural land and our communities. Around 15,000 crofters care for about 750,000 hectares of Scotland's land, and this government backs them with over £40 million every year, because crofting matters, and it matters to our past, it matters to our present, and it matters to our future. Crofting has so much potential, providing opportunities for new entrants and young people, and to make a life in the places that they know and love. And we can do that by supporting a range of approaches to crofting, including agritourism, local food networks, peatland restoration and livestock production, just to name a few. The proposals that have been considered came from a variety of sources, including the Crofting Law Sump, and issues identified and raised by stakeholders over the 3 years of a close collaboration. Over the summer of 2024, we carried out a consultation, and my officials ran 15 public events throughout the Crofting counties, which were attended by 257 people. And I want to take this opportunity to thank my officials for their hard work and for their efforts to ensure that we have a solid bill that has wide stakeholder support. Because this bill delivers positive changes, building on previous reforms, and let me be clear, it represents another step on the journey that we are committed to continue on, and as we work with our crofting communities to secure their future. Crofting law is extremely complex, and even where there is a consensus that something needs changing, it's often difficult to reach a consensus on what the remedy should be. Developing proposals and identifying workable solutions requires time, and something that I think crofting stakeholders are sympathetic to. But this bill is more than just a technical bill. It's also an enabling bill, delivering a number of meaningful improvements to legislation. It will give crofters more options on how they use their land. It will allow approximately 700 people to apply to become a crofter. It will streamline the enforcement of duties and the family assignation process. It will prevent crofters that are in breach of their duties from profiteering and removing land from the crofting tenure. It will prevent the accidental separation of a grazing share from an in-by croft. Landlords and subtenants will be able to report breaches of duty to the Commission, and crofters will be able to apply to the Commission for boundary and registration changes. Now, that amounts to significant change, and this bill will make crofting regulation less onerous for active crofters and the Commission, and flexible enough to grasp new opportunities and cope with future challenges. As I set out in my written response to the committee, I am committed to ensuring that the views raised through the evidence sessions and on the bill are considered, so we are carefully considering a small number of possible amendments, and those include strengthening the wording in the bill regarding environmental use of the croft, providing flexibility to allow non-natural persons to take title of a croft, maintaining linkages between the crofting register and the land register when adjusting boundaries, and, where applicable, maintaining a relationship between the grazing share and the in-by croft. Now, this reform should not be viewed in isolation, but it has to be seen alongside the work that has been done by the Crofting Commission. It's important to note that the interplay between legislation and the Commission's policy plan are vital, and this legislation provides the necessary framework, and the plan provides the detail of how the Commission will administer and regulate. The Commission has the legislative tools, and they now also have the resources to carry out their functions. The changes in this bill will further support the Commission's work in processing regulatory applications and tackling breaches of duty. I'll continue working with the Commission to ensure that it creates more opportunities for new entrants and for young people to enter crofting. The bill prepares the ground for what comes next. It will help lay a stronger and healthier foundation for crofting, where we aim to have increased residency levels and more people actively using their crofts and common grazings. And then we will be in a better place to carefully consider what reform is needed for the future. So I'd like to turn to Part 2 of the Scottish Crofting and Land Court Bill, which provides for the merger of the Scottish Land Court and the Land Tribunal for Scotland. Now, this is a measured and an administrative reform, but one with real practical importance for how land and property disputes are determined in Scotland. Work on these reforms were initiated back in 2015 by Lord Mingonish, following his appointment as the Chair of the Scottish Land Court and President of the Lands Tribunal, and it has continued under Lord Duthie, the current judicial head of both bodies. The provisions in the bill give legislative effect to the work and are grounded on three principles: simplicity, coherence and flexibility. Those principles remain central to Part 2 of the bill before us today. On simplicity, the bill replaces the two bodies operating in closely related areas of law and already sharing some same judicial leadership with a single unified court. This removes unnecessary structural complexity while preserving specialist jurisdictions. On coherence, the committee heard evidence from the judicial stakeholders about the statutory overlap and procedural anomalies arising from the parallel operation of the court and the tribunal, particularly in agricultural holdings and land reform registration. The merger resolves those issues and provides a clearer and more consistent framework. And on flexibility, the bill allows legal, agricultural and valuation expertise to be deployed more effectively across the court's jurisdiction. The administrative integration already in place has demonstrated the benefits of a unified approach, and this bill builds on that experience. In their consideration of the bill, members of the judiciary, including the Chairman of the Land Court, Lord Duthie, raised important points about appeals and procedure, particularly for tribunal-type cases transferring into the court. And I can confirm that we will continue to engage with the judiciary and bring forward Stage 2 amendments to ensure that those points are properly addressed. Alongside the merger provisions, the bill also enables suitably qualified members of the merged court and, on a transitional basis, members of the Lands Tribunal for Scotland to act in the upper tribunal. The intention of these provisions is to enhance the resilience of the upper tribunal by giving it access to a broader range of expertise when required. Presiding Officer, this reform modernises structures without diluting tradition. It creates a more integrated, coherent and flexible system for resolving land and property disputes for Scotland's crofting and rural communities, and I commend this bill to the Chamber.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on Finlay Carson on behalf of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee to open. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm pleased to speak on behalf of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee to present our Stage 1 report. At the outset, I acknowledge the positive feedback from many stakeholders about the Scottish Government's engagement on this bill. We don't often hear this in such praise, and it should be recognised. The committee began scrutiny in June with a call for views, and we held 5 evidence sessions between September and November with stakeholders including the Crofting Commission and the Scottish Government, and we visited the Isle of Skye to meet crofters and held an online event with crofters across Scotland. And I thank everyone who has contributed and for the hard work for the committee, from the committee clerks and Spice, and of course the members of the committee. So, turning to Part 1, the committee recognises the vital contribution crofting makes to Scotland's rural population, economy, environment and cultural heritage. 2 clear messages emerged. Firstly, there is strong support for the bill's targeted approach, fixing specific issues rather than attempting fundamental reform. However, many stakeholders called for a wider, long-term review of crofting law, and we agree and recommend that the next Scottish Government undertakes that review and brings forward comprehensive legislation as soon as practicable. Secondly, we repeatedly heard concerns about enforcing crofters' duties, that is, to live on or near the croft and to maintain and use it purposefully. Crofters want a clear, consistently applied regulatory framework. And we welcome the Crofter Commission's renewed focus on enforcement and the Scottish Government's commitment to strengthen collaboration between the Commission and the Rural Payments and Inspection Division. However, enforcement remains challenging. The committee believes the current system for reporting and enforcing duties should be central to any future review of the crofting law, and we're pleased to hear that the Government shares that view. Sections 1 to 27 make a series of specific, often technical changes. I will therefore focus on those that generated the most debate. On enabling environmental use of crofts and common grazing, we welcome extending the definition of purposeful use to include any environmental use. Crofting land can deliver significant environmental benefits, and simplifying the route to environmental activities is sensible. We heard concerns about absent or negligent crofters and how they may cite environmental use to mask and neglect. The bill does include some safeguards, but we recognise that the strongest protection lies in robust enforcement. On that, we welcome the Minister's commitment to strengthen the definition of environmental use, and it would be helpful if he sets that out in closing today. On common grazings and environmental projects, the treatment and sharing of benefits, particularly carbon credits, requires clarification. We heard support for joint projects on common grazing, but questions remain over fair benefit sharing, while ensuring grazing remains available in the spirit of crofting. Further details from the Minister on this afternoon would also be welcome. On assignations, the family transfer of crofts, the committee supports a fast-track process to reduce administrative pressures on the Crofting Commission so resources can be redirected to enforcement. Some stakeholders queried the proposed 3-croft limit for fast-track use, particularly for crofters with multiple interests. On balance, we accept the Government's rationale and note that those with more than 3 crofts would continue through the existing process. That is fair, proportionate, and a proportionate way to speed up family assignations without compromising oversight. We also heard concerns that prohibiting transfer of owner-occupied crofts could inadvertently hinder community organisations seeking croft land for crofting or housing. So we welcome the Government's intention to explore a Stage 2 amendment to ensure community aspirations are not frustrated. On common grazings, we took strong evidence about problems when grazing shares become unintentionally separated from the in-by croft or croft land. So we support and welcome provisions aimed at preventing such separations. Members differed on whether the bill should go further and prohibit separation entirely. So we note that the Minister's assurance that additional safeguards will be introduced at Stage 2 to tighten practice while retaining flexibility where separation is genuinely desirable. We also welcome consideration of a process to reattach shares that have been unintentionally separated and would appreciate an update on stakeholder discussions about workable solutions. I turn to Part 2, the proposed merger of the Scottish Land Court and Lands Tribunal for Scotland. While some stakeholders worried the merger might be driven by cost-cutting, the general view was that it was pragmatic. We were reassured by the Minister's confirmation that the aim is to streamline and improve operations, not diminish access to justice or expertise. Our report sets out detailed comments, including from the current President of the Court and the Chair of the Tribunal. We welcome the Government's intention to bring forward Stage 2 amendments to tighten Part 2 and clarify issues that we've raised, particularly preserving specialist knowledge, ensuring appropriate routes of appeal and maintaining accountability for rural communities. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the committee supports the bill's general principle. We endorse the targeted approach in Part 1 alongside a clear call for a comprehensive future review of crofting law with enforcement at its core. We support strengthening provisions on environmental use, common grazings and assignations, and look forward to further details from the Minister on definitions, on benefit sharing, safeguarding for grazing shares and community-friendly routes for owner-occupied transfers. Overall, on Part 2, we recognise the potential benefits of the merger subject to Stage 2 amendments that secure clarity, continuity of expertise and access to justice, and I look forward to members' contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Carson. I now call on Tim Eagle to open on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I firstly, I couldn't make it down to Edinburgh last week because of the snow in the north. I was trapped at home with my 3 children who couldn't get to school. But can I thank farmers and crofters? I put that out on Facebook, but I want to say that in here. And I know many people already have said that in here. But without last week, I have teachers up my road. I have doctors, my wife being one of them up my road. We couldn't have got out without their help. And I don't blame anything on local authorities who I think did their best last week to try and get people and make the roads as safe as possible, but thank you to the farmers and crofters across the Highlands and Islands in the north of Scotland. The Scottish Conservatives will back stage 1 of the Crofting Bill today. When I first read the draft report, the major point that I wanted to ensure that it said was to recognise that there is a clear and growing consensus around the need for a much more full-scale review of crofting legislation, and that's just been picked up by Finlay Carson, and that was accepted, I believe, by the Minister in his response to the bill. Crofters across the Highlands and Islands are looking for that important piece of work, one that properly reflects what crofting means in different places and how it operates in those very different local contexts. This bill is a step forward, there's no doubt about that, but it also underlines that a deeper and more comprehensive review is now needed. I welcome the work that has gone into this legislation, and it has been constructive, actually, engagement between the government stakeholders and the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee. Part 1 of the bill does make some sensible technical improvements and addresses a number of practical issues that have caused frustration for some time. That progress is important, and I do think that should be recognised. However, as I've said, many crofters feel that this bill does not yet answer those bigger questions about the future of crofting. And after so many years, and with crofting so ingrained in the way of life for Highlanders and Islanders, this Parliament, I believe, owes them that wider review in the next session. Enforcement has come through strongly in the evidence. Weak enforcement of residency and cultivation duties has damaged trust in the system to some degree, and in some areas the social fabric of crofting communities. While recent efforts by the Crofting Commission are very welcome, crofters want to see this backed by long-term legislative safeguards and proper resourcing so that duties are applied fairly and consistently. Environmental use of crofts is another area where balance is crucial. Environmental outcomes can and should sit alongside crofting, but they must be rooted in active use by real crofters. There is genuine concern that under that land could be neglected or effectively abandoned under the banner of environmental use, and that must be addressed clearly in the legislation. The bill also touches on owner-occupier crofts and common grazings, both of which matter deeply on the ground. There is real anxiety about crofts being priced beyond the reach of local people and new entrants, and about grazing shares becoming detached from the crofting system. These are not abstract legal points. They go to the heart of whether crofting remains viable for future generations, and I think we should all give careful thought for that as we reach stage 2. One interesting area that I think did come up and hasn't been touched on to a great deal in the bill is around the ownership of carbon rights and potentially in the future biodiversity rights. And again, that's something that I think needs to be brought out in stage 2 of the bill. Presiding Officer, I do think the bill is moving things in the right directions, but crofters are clear that this cannot be the final well. So I welcome discussion with the Minister as we head towards stage 2 and the next moves. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Eagle. I now call on Rosa Grant to open on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too want to add my thanks to those who give evidence, the Bill team, indeed committee staff and SPICE as well, who helped us in our consideration of the bill. We support the Crofting and Scottish Land Court Bill. It's a very necessary piece of legislation, and it puts right some of the mistakes that were made in the last Crofting Act. It will help streamline processes and hopefully allow practices to be modernised. Where crofters are desperately disappointed is that it does nothing to deal with the current threats to crofting. These threats include market pressures. This market is not about crofting itself, it's about a housing crisis coupled with the ambition to own second homes or holiday lets. And it does nothing to encourage land use or recognise crofting as an intrinsically agricultural practice where, in order to make a living, a person must also have other employment. Because of this, diversification has been encouraged, and that's meant that diversification such as holiday accommodation and finding other uses for land has eclipsed the agricultural use of crofts. Some of the activities fit well with crofting, things like growing vegetables, weaving and using the produce of the land, but others don't. Second homes and holiday lets are damaging crofting, and the bill does nothing about these. Its only innovation is to look at environmental management as part of crofting, which is a positive move, as long as it doesn't disguise environmental management for dereliction and rewilding. Crofting, by its very nature, is environmentally friendly. Crofters who have carried out carbon audits find that they sequester carbon rather than produce it. And practice is also nature-friendly, and therefore, if we're serious about the environment, we must support some of those traditional aspects of crofting, and also recognise it as an economic driver, but people have to be able to make a living to stay and work in our crofting communities. Neither does the bill make it clear that peat, trees and grass and other essential carbon stores actually belong to the tenant. Crofters have always had the right to cut peat, to grow and cut trees, and indeed we now have woodland crofts. And the bill needs to provide clarity on this issue. If it doesn't, we will face a block to peatland restoration. One of the most complex issues about the bill is also the grazing shares, and many people have talked about that and how they've come adrift from the croft. In most cases, this was unintentional, where the croft was sold and the conveyancing had not included the grazing share with the croft. The bill will put in place a default to stop that happening going forward, but it doesn't deal with the cases that already exist, and action needs to be taken to ensure that the land is being used. And the most straightforward way of doing that would be reuniting the share with the original croft. The Scottish Land Court and Tribunals for Scotland part of the bill is less contentious, but that could be because it was difficult to get discussion about the policy from the service and therefore difficult for the committee to get a clearer view of the practical issues. While we understand there must be a clear separation between the judiciary and Parliament, Parliament, however, has to look at the impact of changes and how that impacts on running of the court services. So there must be the ability to scrutinise that. Presiding officer, this bill will hopefully cut bureaucracy. It does nothing to reduce the complexity or put crofting on a secure footing going forward, and therefore the next Parliament will have to return to this if crofting and its value for slowing depopulation are not lost to future generations.
Thank you, Ms Grant. I now call on Ariane Burgess to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I give my thanks to the Rural Affairs clerks, Spice, the Bill team and everyone else involved in the development and scrutiny of this bill. Crofting is a vital part of Scotland's cultural and social heritage, but it isn't just a reflection of our nation's past. It's a tradition, an institution that's living and breathing and crucial to both our present and our future. Crofting is a glue that holds rural and island communities together and supports their respective economies. And going forward, it offers us a template for low-impact land management that, if adopted more widely across Scotland, can help us meet the major challenges presented by the climate and biodiversity crises and provide fair access to land and food, as well as an antidote to rural depopulation. While I'm pleased that crofting's contribution to Scotland has been acknowledged by the very existence of this bill, I'm glad to see that crofters and other stakeholders are largely happy with its contents. It has to be said that this legislation is something of a missed opportunity. It's been in the pipeline for a decade, and yet what we have before us today is more of a technical exercise, although I did hear the Minister's comments and points on how it is also enabling. But what was hoped for was a more ambitious document that crofters have been calling for, and that sets out a vision for what exactly crofting is for. Key elements that are missing include tighter regulations around the market in tenancies so that crofting can be more accessible, a scheme to create crofts on public land, and a Scotland-wide expansion of where crofting can take place. And I'd be interested to hear from the Minister what work is being done on these much-needed policies. We must ensure, as far as possible, that the next government launches a new crofting bill process to address these matters and others besides, and ideally on a foundation of current work. In terms of what we've got now in the here and now, there is very little in this bill that the Scottish Greens disagree with. It's good to see that crofters will be able to put their land to environmental use, and I hope that this will give the community the confidence to do their bit for Scotland's nature and climate and help to achieve that landscape scale change that's needed if we're to meet the major challenges of this century. I understand that there has been some concern about whether this new power for crofters will lead to abandoned crofts, but with the right safeguards in place, which I'm keen to explore at stage 2, this need not be a concern. Turning to Part 2 of the bill, the merger of the Lands Tribunal and the Land Court seems to be a sensible idea, given the close proximity in which these two institutions work. And it's good to note that the newly formed Scottish Land Court will have jurisdiction over access rights disputes. And I trust this will allow for better, fairer access to justice in this area. There's also an opportunity here to look at how to deliver better, fairer access to justice for those bringing environmental cases. In the policy memorandum that accompanies the bill, the government states that this is, and I quote, intended that consideration will be given to the expanded Land Court taking on new functions in relation to our House cases in time to come. Given Scotland is currently in breach of our House obligations, especially Article 9, which requires access to justice to be fair, equitable, timely and not prohibitively expensive, I'd put the case that we've got the ideal opportunity here to consider how environmental cases could come to this court in the future. Overall, I look forward to working with the Government and colleagues from across the Chamber to deliver an even better crofting and land court system in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Burgess. I now call on Beatrice Wishart to open on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to speak on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats today on the Crofting and Scottish Land Court Bill. I add my thanks to the Bill team, committee clerks and the many organisations and individuals that gave evidence and sent briefings to support the Stage 1 process. Crofting is of vital importance in my Shetland constituency and across the crofting counties in the Highlands and Islands. Cultural heritage, tradition, community and connection to the land are all important aspects of crofting which deliver economic and environmental benefits in rural and island areas. Specific legislation has governed crofting since 1886, when the Crofting Holders Scotland Act was passed under a Liberal government. The Law Society of Scotland has described Scotland's unique crofting law as developing over time in a piecemeal fashion, and it's generally considered to be a complex and difficult area of the law that may be considered outdated in many respects. Reform of this legal landscape has been slow to emerge. A consultation in 2017 led to the Scottish Government stating their intention for a bill to correct known anomalies in crofting legislation, followed by consideration of more fundamental changes. This first phase, however, has taken years to come before the Scottish Parliament. Even allowing for the disruptions of Brexit and the pandemic, many in the crofting communities indicated frustration at this slow pace. A broader review of crofting policy and law to modernise the framework and reduce the intricate and confusing nature of crofting law remains outstanding. On this point, the committee recommends that the new Scottish Government, at the start of the next session, confirm its intention to undertake this review and then bring forward legislation. While not delivering the more fundamental overhaul that is still being called for, the streamlining in this bill is welcome. There was general support for the bill's provisions from stakeholders during the Stage 1 process, and positive feedback about the engagement and co-design between stakeholders and the Scottish Government, something that is important to see continue as the bill progresses. Part 1 of the bill makes changes across various aspects of crofting law, including the enforcement of crofters' duties, the powers of the Crofting Commission, common grazings and the Crofting Register. The bill extends the definition of purposeful use of croft land to include environmental use. The committee heard concerns that this could be used as cover by an absentee or negligent crofter to neglect their croft. The NFUS has stressed that environmental use must be linked to active land management to mitigate this outcome. I note the Minister's commitment to strengthening the definition of environmental use, and I look forward to seeing what is brought forward. This issue is one that should be included in any future review of crofting law. The bill contains provisions to prevent unintended separation of grazing shares. Stakeholders, including the Scottish Crofting Federation and the NFUS, called for more action to reduce the separations of grazing shares and their original parent crofts. It was noted during evidence sessions that in Shetland, grazing shares are attached at point of purchase, forming a part and pertinent of the croft, unlike in most other areas. And it's useful to note these differences across the Highlands and Islands and where they might offer opportunities for learning. Turning now to Part 2 of the bill, which merges the Scottish Land Court and Lands Tribunal for Scotland, The Scottish Government intends this to deliver a more coherent and efficient administration of the services that both currently offer. The committee noted there were divided views in the consultation responses to this proposal and heard that some stakeholders are concerned this move may be motivated by cost cutting. So for this merger to be successful, the new Scottish Land Court must be properly resourced and access to justice must be maintained. Presiding Officer, not only does crofting require full reform, there also needs to be an understanding about what modern crofting life will look like in the years ahead. Working with crofting communities is crucial, and it's important to value and protect this way of life. In conclusion, while there is more to be done to deliver the changes needed to modernise crofting law, I'm pleased to support the Crofting and Scottish Land Court Bill at Stage 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Wishart. We will now move to the open debate. Backbench speeches of up to 4 minutes. I call Alistair Allen to be followed by Edward Mountain. Dr Allen.
Presiding Officer, crofting is, of course, a subject never far from my inbox, and nor is the issue of crofting reform. It is clear that substantial change to 150 years' worth of crofting legislation cannot be achieved in a single bill, but also that the bill before us now is an important first step to that wider reform. It is my view that an additional bill will be needed in the next Parliament. Can I thank other members of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee, our officials and witnesses for their input into this report. I would particularly mention the visit which the committee convener, Mr Carson, and I already mentioned were able to make to Skye. And this visit was, I believe, very useful in helping to inform this report and indeed its conclusion that the committee backs the general principles of the bill. I'd also like to thank the Minister for Agriculture for his engagement with me on the bill directly, but more importantly with the committee more widely. Part 1 of this bill focuses on 9 key areas, which include the expansion of Crofting Commission powers, streamlining the administration of crofting duties, amendments to the Crofting Register and enabling more use of digital communications between crofters and the Commission. It also introduces provisions for the environmental use of crofts and common grazings and sets out definitions of both a crofting community and an owner-occupier. Part 2 of the bill merges the Scottish Land Court and the Lands Tribunal for Scotland, while Part 3 contains more general provisions. Now, as the report mentions, without effective regulation, crofting doesn't function. Concerns remain about the number of crofts which are abandoned or where the crofter is a long-term absentee, and there are likewise concerns about the need for enforcement action on this to allow easier access for new entrants to crofting. The committee welcomes the emphasis on the environment throughout the bill, though is also keen to see safeguards that prevent any wholesale abandonment of agricultural land in the name of that environmental use. While it is out with the scope of this bill, we must see future legislation tackle the issues created by the marketisation of crofts in recent years. As the Minister said in November last year, the present bill prepares the ground for what comes next, helping increase residency levels and active croft use to allow consideration of what is needed thereafter to increase the number of new entrants into crofting and sustain support for existing crofters. As the Scottish Crofting Federation have noted, work on more fundamental reform must get underway in Session 7, with a review into crofting policy and law. This will need to be followed by the introduction of further legislation, continuing the robust engagement that has been to date with stakeholders in this complex area of law. With regards to the bill before us today, I have no doubt that in the course of Stage 2, I will be among those committee members tabling amendments to improve it. However, this bill is, I believe, an important step forward for crofting reform, and stakeholders will want to see it passed. I am therefore very happy to commend the committee's report to the Chamber.
Thank you, Dr Allen. I now call Edward Mountain to be followed by Evelyn Tweed.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to be able to speak to this Stage 1 report on the bill. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the committee and also the clerks on producing a bill, and also to the Minister for organising various meetings across the crofting community to discuss this bill. In fact, I attended one of them on a relatively bright summer night, but it was an interesting meeting. I have to say, though, Presiding Officer, there's a bit of a déjà vu here to the last session of the Parliament, when in 2017 the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee produced a quite lengthy report on crofting law and the need to make changes to crofting law. In that report, the REC Committee made it quite clear that we needed a statement of crofting policy with the aim of crofting laid out, and the fact that it was more than just crofting. It was about keeping language going, keeping the population in the Highlands and keeping the culture of crofting across the Highlands. Now, the REC Committee had some key issues, some of which have been addressed already and some have been addressed in this bill, but it's apposite to remind the Parliament of those. First of all, there were issues relating to the election of crofting commissioners, the management of absenteeism, a new entrance scheme which doesn't seem to have gained any ground at all, definitions of different ownerships of crofts, from owner-occupiers to the various other ones, the mapping of crofts, which again seems to have stalled slightly, and the issue of slipper crofters, i.e. those people who had shares in the grazings but didn't actually own a croft. But one thing it did say in that report, Presiding Officer, and it was quite clear, that sufficient time should be given, and this was in 2017, before that end of that Parliament in 2021, to make sure a new bill was passed. Of course, that never happened. And it's therefore surprising that as we come to the end of this Parliament, that we are now having a bill which I hope will have sufficient time to get all the amendments through. I do actually agree with the REC committees that there needs to be a fundamental review of crofting by the next Parliament. I think that's absolutely fundamental. And some concerns, I think they still raise about the crofting commissions, a lot of issues relating to mapping concerns, and also what I've defined as slipper crofters, i.e. those with grazing shares but no crofts. I think this crofting law reform bill is the low-hanging fruit, I would say. What I would have liked to have seen to come forward is more of a definition of the cultural and economic, social and environmental benefits of crofting. And perhaps, Presiding Officer, to drill down into the 1886 Act, the 1888 Act, the 1891 Act, the 1955 Act, the 1976 Acts and the 1993 Act. Because, of course, when you're looking at crofting law, you have to have all of the acts open at the same time, which for somebody like me, when I was trying to help crofting, it made it somewhat difficult to understand which act was apposite in the matter that you were dealing with. So I think there needs to be proper reform of those acts. I would like to see them drawn together to make crofting vibrant, understandable and enforceable. As to the merger of the Scottish Land Courts and the Lands Tribunal, I'm aware of the expertise problem, and I know that the government are pretty sanguine about it, but I'd like to see some clarity when we come to stage 2. Now, just in summing up, I agree with the general principle of the bills, and I thank the REC Committee. I think there are, however, missed opportunities with this crofting bill. And just to reiterate that I believe a new bill is definitely needed, which is what we said in 2017, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. And I call Evelyn Tweed. Ms Tweed.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to put on record my thanks to those who engaged with the committee on this bill. We heard from a huge number of stakeholders, from organisations to individual crofters, and I'm grateful to them for putting so much time and energy into the committee's work on this. Crofting is important to Scotland, to our heritage and to our rural communities and economies today. Crofting contributes a great deal to vibrant and thriving communities, with 30,000 people living in crofting households. Ensuring crofting is well managed and that legislation allows crofts and the communities around them to thrive has knock-on positive effects. The Scottish Crofting Federation has set out that crofting has a proven track record of supporting and maintaining both population and economic activity in rural areas. The changes set out in this bill are widely supported, but it's important that changes work for crofters. As we heard in our evidence, the activities of crofters and grazing communities is wide and varied, and this is to be celebrated and supported. Enforcement of crofters' duties was widely discussed, and crofters want more effective enforcement. Previous legislation creates a complex system, and we heard from the Crofting Commission that much capacity is diverted to deal with these complications. Crofters shared concerns about a lack of enforcement, and this bill goes some way in streamlining and freeing up Crofting Commission capacity. Provisions in this bill set out greater flexibility for the Crofting Commission, allowing them to make use of digital communication. A wider variety of communication options is to be welcomed, but the committee notes that not all crofters will have access to the internet or a reliable connection. Indeed, homes in rural Scotland are much more likely to rely on slower forms of internet, such as DSL, and we expect that the Commission will anticipate this and continue to offer effective physical communication, but it feels important to note. Over the course of evidence-taking, the Commission also acknowledged the significant issues around its digital capacity and current website. And I am interested to hear how the Commission will be supported to develop its digital capacity. Although the changes set out in this bill are likely to streamline administration for both the Commission and crofters themselves, there is wide appetite for more fundamental change, which we've already heard about today. I was glad to hear the Minister confirm that this is the first step and foundation for wider change. I and many others would welcome more detail on what this might look like. It's vital that crofting is fairly regulated and well enforced without undue burden on crofters themselves. And as a committee, we support the bill at stage 1 and look forward to further changes in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Tweed. We will now move to closing speeches. I call on Ariane Burgess to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There have been several interesting contributions I want to highlight in this debate. Rhoda Grant talked about the need to support the traditional aspects of crofting, and I would add to really recognise things like the macher and how crofters ensure that that treasured and important type of land is maintained, and that that's done through crofting. Many colleagues raised the concerns about the separation of grazing shares, but Beatrice Wishart noted that the situation is nuanced with different circumstances in Shetland than in other parts of the crofting counties. Alistair Allen talked about the importance of addressing the marketisation of crofting, which I agree with him. Edward Mann spoke of the need to reinvigorate the mapping of crofting, which I also agree with. It would be useful to understand how Scotland's land is used, and given that crofting is extensive in parts of my region, it would be good to have a greater picture of that. Evelyn Tweed also interestingly raised a point about the need to make sure that there are options for analogue as well as digital communication between crofters and the Commission. And I think that is an important thing to recognise, that not everybody has moved into the digital space. As I said already, the Scottish Greens support what this bill does. It ties up loose ends which are creating problems on the ground for crofters. But I would like to wrap up my contribution today by thinking about the future. While it's all very well and good fixing the problems crofters face now, as with any other sector, we also need to look beyond the present and into the future. There are multitude of challenges coming down the line that we need to consider, and I've been hearing this from crofters. Even just last night I had a crofter talking to me about this, to ensure that crofters feel supported to adapt to them. For example, the 2045 net zero target is getting even closer, and we also have the Good Food Nation commitments to consider. The job of the Scottish Government is in both instances is to prepare the ground for crofters and positively encourage change in doing so and support the ones that already want to do it. As the Crofting Commission Chair, Andrew Thinn, told the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee, and I quote, "The proposed changes are helpful, but they're only steps on a journey. A large chunk of land in our country is being used suboptimally and is suboptimally productive, which isn't sensible." And he called for us to rethink existing systems of land use and management. And I think when he said that, he wasn't talking specifically about crofting at that point. He was talking about Scotland's rural land in general. And where appropriate, he called on us to consider initiatives like carbon sequestration, peatland restoration and woodland planting. Elements of this legislation we have here today will help to enable crofters to begin the process of adaptation. Take, for example, environmental use. While not perfect in its current form, this part of the bill moves us in the right direction. We need to ensure that everyone who wants to use a croft for environmental purposes has the confidence to do so, and enough confidence in the regulation of this form of land use. And Part 2 of the bill also offers the chance to adapt the justice system so it can handle environmental cases in a better and fairer way. I think everyone here today would agree that fairness should be at the heart of any just transition towards a more environmentally friendly Scotland. Key to ensuring fairness is having a legal system that's fully prepared to deal with environmental cases. As the climate and biodiversity crisis develop, it doesn't take too much to imagine to see that we will need to have the capacity and expertise to handle such cases. Building that system should start today, especially given our House Convention commitments. Scotland's crofting system is unique. It is a culturally significant, low-impact land management model that maintains rural and island populations and their respective economies. The Scottish Greens believe this bill ensures crofting will be slightly simpler, but once this legislation has passed, the next government must move quickly to protect the future of crofting for generations to come.
Thank you, Ms Burgess. I now call on Rhoda Grant to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There's been a lot of consensus in this debate, people talking about what needs to happen with the bill, what changes need to be made, but I think there's agreement on the direction of travel. Discussion, of course, went around the common grazings and how to reattach grazing shares that had inadvertently become detached. And that's quite difficult because it will take a backward look to look at how we track the ownership of those common grazing shares and how we then retrospectively legislate to have them reattached to the crofts that they originally belonged to. And some who give evidence to the committee actually talked about not always having the grazing share attached to a croft because they felt that some people were maybe using their in-by land but not their grazing share because they were no longer rearing animals. But there is already a solution in place to that, in that people can sublet their grazing share if they're not rearing animals but one of their crofting neighbours are and could use that land. So I think that would be a solution to that part of the argument. Yes.
Finlay Carson.
I appreciate Rhoda Grant giving away. I think what's important to emphasise, one of the concerns we had was that if the in-by croft was separated from the grazing shares, there could potentially be the possibility of people speculating in that grazing share, given the value there is now in carbon credits and biodiversity credits.
Rhoda Grant.
Yes, indeed, and that's something that the bill really needs to do something about. I would suggest that it needs to clarify that the carbon credits belong to the tenant, but it also needs to clarify that a grazing share belongs to the original croft. And Beatrice Wishart talked about how this is not an issue in Shetland because the way conveyancing was carried out, the grazing share always belonged to the croft, so we need to make sure that happens elsewhere. Finlay Carson and others talked about the 3 croft limit, which I think the committee were agreeable to because it made sense. But we also understood that the size of crofts was varied hugely. There were some very large crofts, some very small crofts, and some crofts that had been subdivided in the past. And indeed, that was a historical issue, that the croft was often subdivided between family members to the point where they didn't really become, they weren't really an economic driver at all. So I think as a rule of thumb, yes, a 3-croft limit, but every application needs to be looked in its own merit, especially looking at the size of the croft that is going to be transferred. Alistair Allen talked about abandonment and dereliction, and also other members talked about environmental crofting and kind of the crossover there. I think the Minister has already agreed that he will strengthen the bill to make sure that environmental crofting can't be disguised as abandonment and dereliction. But we also need to realise that there is crofting laws in place that is already takes a stand against abandonment and dereliction. We need to make sure that the Crofting Commission has the ability to do that. We also need to make sure that people can report that. The previous Crofting Bill made that a duty on the Gracings Clerk. We knew that wouldn't work. I'm really pleased that that's coming out of this bill, but I think it should also widen who can report dereliction to make sure it doesn't happen. Presiding Officer, the future of crofting is really important, and we need more comprehensive legislation. That legislation needs to understand that crofting has evolved differently in the different areas of the crofting counties, and Beatrice Wishart talked about Shetland and the grazing share, which just shows that to be the case. Arian Burgess said that crofting is the glue that holds communities together, and that is really the case, and we need to make sure we protect it for future generations.
Thank you, Ms Grant. And I call on Jamie Halker-Johnson to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I firstly declare my interests as a partner in a farming partnership, a member of SLE and a crofting landlord. We've heard a great deal today about the history of crofting, but also from all sides of the chamber about the role that crofting still plays today, particularly in some of our most remote and rural communities, many of which, of course, are in my own Highlands and Islands region. But the crofting of today is not the crofting of 1886, when, as we've heard, the Crofting Holdings Act went through Parliament, nor is it even the crofting of 1993, when the most recent attempt was made to consolidate crofting legislation in a more coherent framework. There has been an ongoing process of change, mirroring the process of change to other types of land tenure and also to the agricultural sector. And this is the right approach. If crofting is to maintain its relevance, it can't remain something frozen in time. The Scottish Government has indicated that today's bill is a foundation, one that aims to, in the words of the Minister, prepare the ground for what comes next. And this has been the subject of a great deal of discussion and reflection in those crofting communities. But it is the hope of members, certainly on this side of the chamber, that the bill does have measurable outcomes in its own right. And that progress can be demonstrated by the Scottish Government if it's passed by this Parliament. This is not just in terms of increasing occupancy and ensuring purposeful use, or in reducing the occasions where enforcement powers have to be used. It's also about ensuring that the novel elements in the bill are closely examined and reviewed. And this is particularly important in relation to the environmental provisions, where we should hope to see credible outcomes. As the Stage 1 report has illustrated, plenty of organisations have outlined where these provisions may provide opportunities for neglect or adverse effects. Confidence will be increased not simply by pointing to the protections in the bill, but also by clear assurances that these possible outcomes will be actively monitored. The bill will strengthen the powers of the Crofting Commission. However, it is essential that these powers are put to good use, that oversight is exercised sensibly, and ultimately that the purposes and functions of the Crofting Commission are clear and unambiguous, with a solid mandate to act when it is necessary. We will support this bill at Stage 1. However, given the time it has taken, in many ways this bill falls short in addressing the many pressing issues in the crofting sector. Detailing some of the issues in the background to the bill, my colleague Finlay Carson spoke on behalf of the committee and outlined some important parts of their report. As the report recognises, there is an appetite for deeper and more fundamental reforms to the sector. This will, of course, be an issue for a new Parliament following this year's elections. It would be difficult to bring all the issues raised by the committee into the scope of a short speech, but I'm sure we all hope that its recommendations are reflected in the future work of the Scottish Government. Tim Eagle said the bill was a step forward, but there was a need for more comprehensive review, one which answers some of the bigger questions, and that people weren't priced out of local crofts. He also highlighted the need for crofts to be in active use, an issue raised also by Dr Allen and by Edward Mountain, and also hinted at by Rhoda Grant when she highlighted the concerns around second homes and holiday accommodations, which this bill won't address. Edward Mountain also welcomed the committee's report and spoke about its content, but framed today's bill very clearly in terms of a missed opportunity. And he also rightly noted the several outstanding issues which will now need to be tackled in the next session, but also the indications given by the Scottish Government that these would be recognised in this session too. Presiding Officer, there is a broad consensus in favour of reforming crofting law and ensuring we have a framework that will work for the future. And there is a collective will in this chamber to get this legislation right, while looking forward to the future and perhaps more extensive reforms. It's my hope and my belief that positive work can happen as this bill progresses, if the Scottish Government is prepared to take on board a number of the issues raised today. But this bill and today's debate still leaves an important question unanswered. What is this Government's and this Parliament's vision for the long-term future of crofting? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Harper-Johnson. I now call on Minister Jim Fairley to wind up the debate. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank the members across the chamber for the very consensual way that we've actually had this debate today. But I think that goes to the point that I made in my opening statement, and that is the extensive amount of very good engagement that has been done by the Bill team and my officials to make sure that we bring the crofting community along with us. There's been a number of members have stated, there's a number of points I'd like to make about what members have said, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to associate the names to all the points that I'm going to make, but there's a number of members who have talked about the fact that there isn't enough in this bill, or that needs more wholesale legislative reform. But it was never the intention that this bill would deliver fundamental reform. This bill is a technical bill in nature that provides the improvements that we need, whilst also enabling crofters to take greater control of how they use their land. And although future reform will be necessary, I would caution against rushing straight into it. What we first need to do is establish what should crofting policy be in the future. And similar to the approach that we took in this bill, we need stakeholders to consider what that policy is. Although it is ultimately the responsibility of government to deliver that policy, it should not be done unless we've got good evidence from the stakeholders. I should also point out, before I take the intervention, that this would also need to be cleared by any future government's Cabinet and Cabinet subcommittee. I'll take the intervention.
Finlay Carson.
I appreciate the Minister giving away, but I'm surprised I'm saying rushing into it. There's been talk and debate and consultation over future crofting policy for decades. And sadly, the not rush into excuses, one we hear too often from the SNP. We accept this was a bill that addressed some of the technicalities, but there is a call out there from the majority of crofters for radical change, and that change to come sooner rather than later.
Minister.
We almost got through a consensual debate without any dispute at all. However, I'll take the point on that Mr Carson makes, that we shouldn't rush this. What I mean by that is we need to do this next process, because what today has absolutely shown is the complexity in crofting law. Anybody who's listening to this who's not absolutely embedded in crofting will not have a clue what most of us are talking about. So therefore, when we go through this, to get the complexity of the crofting law that we currently have, we need to make sure that we've done the work, we've engaged with the stakeholders, and we understand what it is that crofting is going to deliver for the people of Scotland and, more importantly, for the crofters of Scotland. And I think that's a vital piece of work that we need to undertake in the next session. Now, the bill provides crofters and landowners with the legislative framework to help them to approach to take forward environmental issues. And that's been mentioned by a number of members, and it's something that I'm going to touch on just now. We've got to avoid the situation where crofters are unable to access future funding schemes that incentivise certain environmental uses, and that's one of the things that will be picked up in this bill. But when we're talking about carbon credits, we don't fully understand yet who owns those carbon credits. And I think it would be premature to state in crofting legislation where those carbon rights sit. Bear with me 1 second. Whether the landlord or the crofter. In the meantime, I would absolutely encourage crofters to make sure they go into these joint ventures with their landowners and crofters so that there is mutual benefit. And yes, I'll take the intervention.
I think it's quite clear where those carbon credits sit, because the crofter can dig peat, they can cut trees, they can plant trees on their crofts. So the landowner couldn't claim the carbon credit, because if they were, say, claiming carbon credits for peatland restoration and the crofter decided to start cutting a new peat bank, they couldn't do it. They have no control over the trees or the peat on the land, so therefore it must lie with the crofter.
Minister.
And there we have the complexity of crofting law and who owns what. And that's why we need to take our time and fully consider these proposals so that we absolutely get it right, which is one of the things that should really be considered in the next crofting bill. There were issues that were raised, and I don't know if it was a member in here today. We talked about the 3-croft limit for family assignation and how that might disproportionately impact on crofters who have got multiple crofting interests. We want to reduce the burden on crofting regulation whether it makes sense to do so. Commission resources need to be freed up by this change that we're bringing forward, so that there will be more time available for the Commission to deploy elsewhere on enforcement duties, and I'll come back to that in a second or two. So we settled on 3 crofts, and we felt that that struck the right balance between the policy intention, which is due to improve the efficiency of the service provided to customers, and those concerns that it could result in croft collecting or land banking. So that's an issue that I hope gives some comfort, that just because a crofter owns more than 3 crofts, they'd have to go through the process, but it doesn't mean to say that they wouldn't be able to take on other crofts. They would just have to go through the same process as everybody else, whereas the proposal in the bill is that family assignations should be done far more easily, and I think that is something that has been widely welcomed. There's also the point about the Commission needs sufficient resources and staff based locally to monitor and enforce compliance, and I absolutely agree. I meet regularly with the Commission's CEO and the Chair to discuss the Crofton Commission's performance. The Commission is increasing its enforcement work, and last year, through taking some form of regulatory action, they have commenced engagement with 215 crofters, and they've resolved 134 breaches of the duty. Now, I'm well aware across the crofting communities and the crofting counties that there is a historical lack of faith in the Crofting Commission, but I think under the current regime with Andrew Thinn and Gary Campbell, we've got 2 people who are absolutely determined that their board can make sure that what they're doing is delivering the right assessment of the duties and making sure that crofters are carrying out their duties. Presiding Officer, there are many other points that I'd like to touch on, however, I'm running out of time. So, should members agree to support the general principles of the bill today, I commit to working with members right across the chamber to better the lot of our nation's crofters and to deliver an effective crofting and Scottish Land Court bill that provides our people and our communities one that we can be rightly proud of. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on the Crofting and Scottish Land Court bill as stage 1. It's time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of motion 20169 in the name of Shona Robertson on a financial resolution for the Crofting and Scottish Land Court bill. And I call on Jim Fairley to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 20415 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on changes to business. Any member who wishes to speak to the motion should press their request to speak button now. And I call on Graham Day to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 20415 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next item of business is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau motion 20416 on suspension of standing orders. And I ask Graham Day, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak to the motion. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau motion 20417 on designation of a lead committee. And I ask Graham Day, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. The question on this motion will be put at decision time, and there are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first is that motion 20388, in the name of Jim Fairley, on the Crofting and Scottish Land Court Bill at Stage 1 be agreed? Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 20169 in the name of Shona Robertson on a financial resolution on the Crofting and Scottish Land Court Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 20416 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on suspension of standing orders be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access digital voting.